On the morning of March 21st, 1947, the atmosphere at 2078 Fifth Avenue in Harlem was characterized by a high concentration of ozone and the heavy, sweetish scent of organic decomposition. The air was stagnant, trapped within a structure that had been hermetically sealed by its own contents. Patrolman William Barker, acting on an anonymous tip regarding a potential corpse, ascended a ladder to the second-story window. What he encountered was not a residence, but a structural anomaly. The brownstone, built in the late 19th century with a load-bearing capacity designed for residential furniture, was currently supporting an estimated 140 tons of miscellaneous debris. This internal pressure exerted a lateral force against the brick masonry that threatened the building's very integrity. The entry point was a window where the glass had long since been replaced by grime and crystallized soot. Upon breaching the frame, Barker was confronted by a solid wall of bundled newspapers, reached nearly to the ceiling. These were not merely scattered papers, they were architectural components. Over decades, the cellulose fibers had absorbed ambient moisture, undergoing a process of compression that turned them into dense, wood-like blocks. Between these walls of print, a network of tunnels had been excavated. These passages were narrow, rarely exceeding 2 feet in width, requiring any inhabitant to crawl or squeeze through. The physics of the hoard was treacherous. A single displaced bundle could trigger a localized collapse of several hundred pounds of paper. In a small clearing amidst this labyrinth, Barker found the body of Homer Collyer. The deceased was 65 years old, found in a seated position with his head resting on his knees. He was wearing a tattered blue bathrobe, a garment that had once represented the height of domestic luxury but was now a substrate for mold and dust mites. The clinical cause of death would later be determined as starvation and heart disease, but the environmental context was the true killer. The room was a graveyard of 19th century elite artifacts, a Bausch and Lomb microscope, stacks of sheet music, and the decaying remains of a Steinway piano. The silence in the room was absolute, muffled by the acoustic dampening effect of thousands of tons of paper. Outside, the Harlem of 1947 was a neighborhood in profound transition. Once an enclave for the city's white elite, the Great Migration had transformed it into the capital of black culture and struggle. The Collyer mansion stood as a stubborn, decaying relic of the Gilded Age, refusing to acknowledge the shifting demographics or the post-World War II economic boom. At the time, the median rent in New York was approximately $50 per month, yet the brothers sat atop a frozen fortune. The municipal authorities of the era were ill-equipped for such a case. The New York Department of Sanitation and the NYPD had no protocol for hoarding, a term that would not enter the psychological lexicon for decades. To the gawkers on the street, this was simply the ghost house. The scale of the hoard was a technical marvel of obsession. Every square inch of the 12-room house was utilized. The thermal mass of the paper created a microclimate inside the house, retaining the winter's cold deep into the spring months. Forensic investigators would later note the presence of thousands of Daily News and New York Times editions organized by date, forming a chronological stratigraphy of the early 20th century. The cost of a newspaper in 1947 was roughly 5 cents, equivalent to about 0.75 in 2026. But to the Colliers, the information contained within was a resource to be protected at all costs. They were not merely keeping trash, they were archiving a world they felt had abandoned them. As the police began the arduous task of clearing the entrance, they were unaware that the structure was rigged. Langley Collyer, the younger brother and a trained engineer, had applied his knowledge of physics to create lethal deterrents. The tunnels were not just passages, they were corridors of traps. The fortune they were protecting was estimated at the time to be worth over $100,000, a sum that would translate to roughly $1.6 million in 2026 purchasing power. But as the first bundles of paper were removed, the investigators realized a chilling fact. Homer Collyer had been dead for several days, yet there was no sign of the brother who had supposedly been his sole caregiver. The true danger of the house was not the dead, but the invisible architect of its defenses. Homer Laska Collyer and Langley Wakeman Collyer were the biological products of a lineage defined by intellectual rigor and Manhattan's high society. Their father, Dr. Herman Livingston Collyer, was a prominent gynecologist at Bellevue Hospital. In the late 19th century, the medical profession was undergoing a massive shift toward clinical specialization. Dr. Collyer was at the forefront, earning a salary that permitted the purchase of the 3-story brownstone at 2078 Fifth Avenue in 1909. The property was a masterpiece of neo-Greek architecture, featuring high ceilings, intricate crown moldings, and a facade of Connecticut brownstone. At the time of purchase, the home was valued at approximately $40,000, which in 2026 would be the equivalent of $1.35 million. The domestic environment was curated by their mother, Susie Gage Frost, a former operatic singer and a descendant of the Livingstons, one of New York's colonial first families. The social etiquette of the era was rigid. The Collyer home was a fortress of Victorian propriety. The brothers were groomed for excellence. Homer attended Columbia University, graduating with a degree in law in 1904. His education occurred during the Lochner era of the Supreme Court, where the legal system prioritized property rights and freedom of contract above all else, a philosophy that would later manifest in the brothers' absolute refusal to yield their property to the city. Langley, younger by 4 years, studied at Columbia's School of Mines, Engineering, and Chemistry. He was a polymath, excelling in mechanical engineering while simultaneously becoming a concert-level pianist. The technical infrastructure of their upbringing was opulent. The house was equipped with the latest innovations of the 1910s, gas lighting that would later be converted to early DC electrical wiring, and a central heating system that utilized coal-fired boilers. Inside, the brothers were surrounded by 14 pianos, ranging from uprights to full-sized concert grands. Each instrument was a marvel of Victorian engineering, featuring cast-iron plates and complex action mechanisms made of spruce and hornbeam. The library contained thousands of volumes, including medical journals, engineering blueprints, and leather-bound legal treatises. The annual cost of maintaining such a household, including servants and property taxes, exceeded $5,000, roughly $150,000 today. In 1919, the family dynamic shattered. Dr. Herman Collyer abruptly abandoned his wife and sons, moving to a separate residence at 153 West 77th Street. The reasons remained a matter of private scandal, shielded by the family's intense desire for anonymity. When the doctor died in 1923, he left behind a massive estate. His sons inherited a portfolio consisting of high-yield municipal bonds, real estate holdings in Manhattan, and significant cash reserves. The liquid portion of the inheritance alone was valued at $100,000, which in 2026 represents a purchasing power of $1.85 million. However, the true inheritance was a psychological predisposition toward isolation. Susie Collyer, now the matriarch of a crumbling dynasty, withdrew further from society, taking her sons with her into a state of shared reclusion. The macroeconomic climate of the early 1920s was one of extreme volatility. Post-WWI inflation was followed by the Roaring Twenties boom. While the rest of New York embraced the Jazz Age, the Collyers viewed the rapid social changes with profound suspicion. They watched as the elite white families moved further uptown or to the suburbs of Westchester, but they remained anchored to 2078 Fifth Avenue. The architecture of the house began to reflect their state of mind. They stopped painting the exterior, they ceased the routine maintenance of the plumbing and electrical systems. They were wealthy men living in a neighborhood that was becoming increasingly impoverished, yet they refused to modernize or relocate. Their fortune was stagnant, invested in the past. By the mid-1920s, the brothers had effectively retired from their respective professions. Homer's law practice withered as he refused to meet clients, and Langley's engineering career never progressed beyond the theoretical. They spent their days in the dim light of the mansion, surrounded by the physical artifacts of their parents' success. They were the apex of the American dream, turned inward. The education that was meant to make them leaders of industry had instead provided them with the tools to construct a perfect, impenetrable reality. They were safe within their walls of leather and mahogany, unaware that the very education meant to liberate them was becoming the first layer of the wall that would eventually bury them alive. In 1929, the internal atmosphere of the brownstone at 2078 Fifth Avenue underwent a permanent shift from a state of eccentric reclusion to one of pathological entombment. The catalyst was the death of Susie Gage Frost Collyer. Her passing marked the end of the brothers' last vestigial connection to the social norms of the Gilded Age. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Victorian cult of mourning dictated elaborate rituals. The covering of mirrors with black crepe, the use of specialized stationery, and the strict observance of a 2-year mourning period. The Collyer brothers, however, extended this period indefinitely. They did not merely mourn their mother. They preserved the exact state of the house at the moment of her death, treating the physical structure as a reliquary. By the end of 1929, the estate they shared was valued at approximately $150,000. In 2026 purchasing power, this sum represents a liquidity of roughly $2,780,000, yet not a single cent was allocated toward the upkeep of the property. The macroeconomic context of 1929 provided the perfect validation for their burgeoning paranoia. The Wall Street crash of October 24th, Black Thursday, shattered the American public's faith in the banking system. Between 1929 and 1933, nearly 9,000 banks failed, wiping out the life savings of millions. The Collyer brothers, observing the panic from behind their heavy velvet curtains, concluded that institutional finance was a predatory illusion. They began a systematic process of withdrawing their assets from the Bowery Savings Bank and other institutions, converting their digital and paper wealth into physical currency and gold certificates. This was a massive logistical undertaking. They hid cash in unconventional locations, within the hollowed-out mechanisms of their 14 pianos, inside the linings of Victorian overcoats, and between the pages of Homer's extensive legal library. Every dollar stored in 1929 would have the buying power of approximately $18 in 2026, making their hidden stashes a high-stakes target for any potential intruder. The technical degradation of the mansion began in earnest during this decade. The brownstone itself was a victim of its own material composition. The facade was constructed from Portland brownstone, a Triassic-Jurassic sandstone that is notoriously susceptible to spalling, a process where water enters the porous rock, freezes, and causes the outer layers to flake off. Without the application of protective sealants or regular masonry work, the house began to physically shed its skin. Inside, the lack of ventilation led to a rise in relative humidity, which triggered the rapid oxidation of the metal components within the house. The silver service sets, inherited from the Livingstons, turned black with tarnish. The silk upholstery on the Louis XIV chairs began to undergo shattering, a chemical breakdown of fibers common in weighted silks from the late 1800s. The brothers did not intervene. They viewed this decay as a natural barrier between themselves and the world they no longer recognized. Secondary characters in this period, such as the local delivery boys and the occasional meter reader, began to describe the brothers as apparitions. One such figure was the local grocer who noted that Langley would only shop in the early hours of the morning, long before the sun hit the Harlem streets. He purchased items with a shelf life that defied the era's lack of refrigeration. Salted meats, hardtack, and crates of laranjas, oranges. In 1930, a crate of oranges cost about $2.50, or roughly $46 today. Langley's obsession with oranges was not merely dietary, it was a medical strategy. As Homer's health began to fail, Langley, applying a layman's understanding of chemistry and nutrition, believed that massive doses of vitamin C could cure almost any ailment, including the cataracts that were slowly robbing his brother of his sight. This period also saw the total cessation of utility services. The New York Edison Company, the precursor to Con Edison, cut off the electricity in the early 1930s due to non-payment. The brothers did not protest. They reverted to kerosene lamps and candles, a decision that carried immense risk in a house increasingly filled with paper. A single candle flame in a room packed with 19th century cellulose was a recipe for a thermal event that could reach 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit in minutes. To heat the house during the brutal New York winters, Langley attempted to build a localized heating system using a small kerosene stove and a series of improvised pipes, a testament to his engineering background used for regressive ends. They were wealthy men living in a self-imposed dark age, surrounded by millions of dollars that were as useless as the dust settling on their pianos. The legal reality of the time offered them little protection. The 1930s saw the tightening of New York City's building codes as the Department of Building sought to eliminate the fire traps of the previous century. The Collyer mansion was a flagrant violation of every safety ordinance on the books. Yet because they owned the property outright and the neighborhood was in a state of economic flux, the authorities remained largely indifferent until the complaints from neighbors regarding the smell and the rat population became too loud to ignore. The brothers viewed any knock at the door as an act of war. They were no longer citizens. They were sovereign occupants of a fortress of debris. Their isolation was absolute, but the external world was not done with them. The true transformation of the house was about to begin, as Langley realized that a vault is only as good as its traps. By the mid-1930s, Langley Collyer had fully transitioned from a concert pianist to a defensive engineer. His primary project was the fortification of the mansion, a task he approached with the cold logic of a military tactician. He viewed the vast quantities of waste not as trash but as structural material. The core of his defensive strategy was the utilization of potential energy. He began to construct deadfall traps throughout the house. These were massive bundles of newspapers, often weighing upwards of 300 pounds, suspended or balanced precariously over the narrow tunnels. These bundles were connected to trip lines made of high-tensile nylon or thin copper wire salvaged from the house's defunct electrical system. A single misstep by an intruder would trigger a release of these weights, creating a localized avalanche of paper that would pin or suffocate the victim instantly. The technical specifications of these traps revealed Langley's sophisticated understanding of physics. He utilized the principle of the center of gravity to balance stacks of the New York Times and the Daily News in such a way that they appeared stable, but were actually on the verge of collapse. The friction between the layers of newsprint provided just enough resistance to keep the stacks upright under normal conditions, but the application of lateral force, such as a person pushing through the tunnel, would exceed the static friction coefficient, resulting in a kinetic failure of the entire stack. In 2026 terms, Langley was building a low-tech security system with a 100% lethality rate and zero power requirements. He was creating a labyrinth where he was the only person who knew the safe path, calculated down to the inch. A central artifact of this era was the chassis of a Ford Model T, which Langley had somehow moved into the basement. The Model T, the car that put the world on wheels, was a masterpiece of 1920s engineering. It featured a 177 cubic inch 2.9L four-cylinder engine producing 20 horsepower. In the mid-30s, a used Model T chassis could be acquired for as little as $5, or about $110 in 2026. Langley's intention for the car was not transportation, but power generation. He planned to hook the engine to a dynamo to generate his own electricity, bypass the city's grid, and restore light to the mansion. However, the project stalled as the hoarding intensified. The car was eventually cannibalized for parts. The metal frame used as a structural brace for a tunnel. The gears used as components for his elaborate trap triggers. The car that symbolized the mobility of the American spirit was now a literal weight holding the brothers in place. The scale of the hoarding was staggering. Langley was not a random accumulator, he was a systematic archivist of the obsolete. He collected 25,000 books, thousands of medical journals belonging to his father, and over 140 tons of paper. He also collected technological failures, broken sewing machines, outdated farm implements, and the inner workings of clocks. His logic was that if society collapsed during the Great Depression, he would possess the raw materials and the knowledge to rebuild civilization from within his walls. This was the prepper mindset, decades before the term existed. The cost of these items was negligible, but the opportunity cost, the value of the space they occupied, was astronomical. By 1938, the 12-room mansion had an effective living space of less than 200 square feet. The neighborhood of Harlem in the 1930s was a place of intense struggle and vibrant life, but the Collyer brothers were a source of constant friction. Their property, which was once an asset, had become a negative externality for the surrounding community. The smell of the house, a mixture of rotting paper, vermin droppings, and stagnant air, drifted onto Fifth Avenue. Property values in the immediate vicinity were negatively impacted. Local children created games around the ghost house, daring each other to touch the front door. To Langley, these children were not neighbors, but scouts for a hostile invading force. He responded by boarding up the windows from the inside with heavy timber and steel plates, creating a blackout effect that was permanent. The only light that entered the house was the flickering glow of kerosene lamps, which cast long, distorted shadows across the walls of trash. Homer, by this time, was a prisoner of his own body. He had suffered several strokes and was completely blind. Langley took on the role of his sole caregiver, a task that required him to navigate the treacherous tunnels several times a day to bring food and water to his brother. He fed Homer a diet of 100 oranges a week, convinced that the high doses of citric acid would eventually dissolve the cataracts. This medical delusion was a tragic misapplication of his scientific background. He recorded Homer's symptoms with clinical precision in a series of notebooks, but never once called for a professional doctor. He trusted no one. The brothers were locked in a symbiotic death spiral. The fortune they held, now including property that would be worth millions in a modern market, was being spent on the slow, meticulous construction of their own tomb. Langley had built the perfect defense, but he had forgotten one crucial law of engineering. Every structure requires an exit. By the late 1930s, the interior of 2078 Fifth Avenue had reached a state of entropic equilibrium where the remnants of Gilded Age opulence were physically bonded to the refuse of the Great Depression. This was the era of the Golden Ghost Mansion, a period where the brothers functioned as the curators of a decaying museum. The technical centerpiece of this collection was the array of 14 pianos. These were not merely instruments. They were feats of 19th century precision engineering. Most were Steinway & Sons Model B and Model D concert grands, featuring the patented overstrung scale design and a diaphragmatic soundboard made of Sitka spruce. In the 1930s, a new Steinway Model D cost approximately $3,000. The equivalent of $68,000 in 2026. Within the mansion, these instruments were subjected to a microclimate of extreme humidity and fluctuating temperatures, causing the cast iron plates to strain against the wooden frames. The high tension of the strings, totaling nearly 20 tons of pressure, remained a latent kinetic hazard in the silent rooms. Langley, despite the surrounding squalor, would still perform the works of Frédéric Chopin, his fingers moving over ivory keys that were slowly delaminating from their wooden bases due to the failure of the animal hide glues. The textiles within the mansion represented another layer of concealed wealth and technical failure. Buried beneath mounds of 1914 newspapers were Aubusson tapestries and hand-woven Persian rugs of the Isfahan variety. These rugs were typically constructed with a knot density of over 500 knots per square inch, using silk and wool dyed with natural pigments like madder root and indigo. In the 1930s, such items were worth thousands. Today, in pristine condition, they would fetch six-figure sums at auction. However, they were undergoing a process known as shattering. Late Victorian silk was often weighted with metallic salts, specifically tin and iron, to give the fabric a more luxurious drape and a heavier hand. Over time, these minerals act as catalysts for oxidation, causing the silk fibers to become brittle and literally crumble into dust upon contact. The Colliers were effectively sitting on a fortune that was chemically disintegrating. They dined on Limoges porcelain, a high-fired kaolin clay ceramic known for its translucency and durability, yet they ate cold canned meat while the silver candelabras nearby were thick with black silver sulfide. The macroeconomic landscape of the late 1930s saw the end of the New Deal and the slow mobilization of the American industrial machine. New York was preparing for the 1939 World's Fair, themed The World of Tomorrow. While the city looked toward a future of streamlined aluminum and television, the Collyer mansion remained a tomb of the 19th century. The brothers' financial strategy was one of total stasis. They held titles to several properties in Manhattan that, despite the Depression, maintained a collective value of nearly $200,000, roughly $4.5 million in 2026. However, they lacked the liquid cash to pay basic property taxes. Their secondary characters were the tax assessors and process servers who began to circle the property like vultures. Among them was the real estate developer Cyrus C. Miller, a former Bronx borough president who viewed the Collyer property as a blight on the developing Harlem landscape. Miller and his contemporaries represented the new New York, aggressive, litigious, and focused on urban renewal. To the brothers, they were simply the invaders. The archive curiosities of this period include the brothers' insistence on maintaining the social etiquette of their parents' era. Despite their physical state, they possessed a wardrobe of bespoke suits from Savile Row and silk opera hats. These hats used a complex internal spring mechanism to allow them to be folded flat, a triumph of Victorian mechanical design. Langley would occasionally dress in these rags of finery to move through the house, a ghost of the elite class he had inherited. The cost of a custom suit in the 1930s was about $100 or $2,200 today. He wore these garments until they were held together by grease and safety pins, yet he refused to purchase modern, cheaper clothing. This was a tactical adherence to a dead social hierarchy. They were not merely poor, they were declassed aristocrats who chose to rule over a kingdom of garbage rather than serve in a world of progress. The mansion was a closed system, a thermodynamic nightmare where the only thing being produced was more entropy. The psychological toll on Homer was absolute. By 1939, he was not only blind but suffering from advanced rheumatism, a condition exacerbated by the damp, unheated environment. The atmospheric moisture within the house was constantly absorbed by the 140 tons of paper, creating a wet bulb effect that made the winters feel colder and the summers more suffocating. Langley, the engineer, attempted to mitigate this by creating heat traps using stacked boxes to insulate Homer's living area, but this only served to further restrict the oxygen supply. The brothers were now operating on a purely instinctual level of survival, their intellects entirely consumed by the logistical demands of their hoard. They had achieved the ultimate privacy, but at the cost of their physical humanity. The candles they used for light were 19th century tallow versions, which produced a thick, black smoke that coated every surface in a layer of oily soot, further obscuring the gold and silk that lay hidden in the corners. The transition from the 1930s to the 1940s was marked by the brothers' total withdrawal from the daytime world. They had effectively desynced from the human race. While the rest of the world adjusted to the rhythm of the industrial clock and the radio broadcast, the Collyers lived in a timeless void, punctuated only by the biological needs of Homer and the midnight excursions of Langley. They were the ultimate negative wealth anomaly, possessing assets that could have fueled a life of ultimate luxury, yet living in a state of deprivation that would shock a tenement dweller. Their wealth was no longer a tool for influence. It was a weight designed to keep the world out. But as the 1940s began, the world exterior would develop new ways to pierce their armor, and the ghost mansion would soon face its most persistent enemy, the modern bureaucracy of the city. By 1940, Langley Collyer had refined his midnight runs into a precise logistical operation. These excursions were necessitated by the total failure of the mansion's life support systems. To secure water, Langley utilized a specialized key to open municipal fire hydrants at 3 a.m., a time when the NYPD patrols were at their lowest frequency. The New York City water system of the 1940s was a gravity-fed marvel, drawing from the Croton Reservoir, but for Langley, it was a resource to be stolen under the cover of darkness. He would transport water in heavy galvanized steel buckets, a material chosen for its resistance to corrosion, though the physical toll of carrying 40 pounds of water through the narrow, slanted tunnels of the house was immense. Each gallon of water was a tactical victory against a city that had long ago cut off his pipes. The dietary requirements of the brothers were met through a similar clandestine process. Langley would trek several miles to various markets, often as far as the Bronx, to avoid being recognized. He focused his purchases on bulk quantities of oranges and peanut butter. His obsession with oranges was based on a flawed understanding of the 1928 discovery of vitamin C, ascorbic acid, by Albert Szent-Györgyi. Langley believed that if he could provide Homer with an intake of 100 oranges per week, he could reverse the structural damage to Homer's optic nerves caused by cataracts and diabetic retinopathy. In 1941, 100 oranges cost approximately $3.50, the equivalent of $75 in 2026. This was a significant expenditure for a man who looked like a vagrant, but Langley viewed it as a medical investment. He would hand-squeeze the juice into Victorian crystal glassware, feeding it to his paralyzed brother in the pitch black of their fortress. The appearance of Langley during these runs became the stuff of Harlem folklore. He wore a heavy, filthy overcoat, even in the humidity of a New York summer, held together by an excessive number of safety pins. The safety pin, patented by Walter Hunt in 1849, was a simple but effective piece of engineering. A single piece of wire with a coiled spring and a clasp. Langley used hundreds of them, creating a suit of metal and wool that rattled as he walked. He was a public nuisance in the legal sense of the 1940s, a concept codified in New York law to describe anything that endangers the health, safety, or property of a considerable number of persons. Yet because he never committed a violent act and always retreated into his private property, the police were legally hamstrung. They could not enter without a warrant, and Langley was careful never to provide probable cause. The macroeconomic shift of 1941, with the United States' entry into World War II, further isolated the brothers. The city implemented mandatory blackout drills to prepare for potential Luftwaffe bombings. For most New Yorkers, this required installing heavy curtains. For the Collyers, their house was a permanent blackout zone. The war led to the rationing of various goods, including sugar, meat, and gasoline. Langley's hoarding instinct, which had seemed like madness in the 1920s, suddenly mirrored the national push for salvaging materials for the war effort. However, while the government wanted scrap metal for tanks, Langley wanted it for his barricades. He viewed the national scrap drives with contempt, refusing to part with a single rusted gear or broken tool. To him, the war was just another external noise, an annoyance that made it harder to find his specific brands of canned goods. Secondary characters of this era included the Collyer Watchers, a group of local teenagers and curious onlookers who would wait for Langley's rare appearances. Among them were aspiring journalists who saw the brothers as a human interest story that could sell papers. In 1942, a journalist from the New York Herald Tribune managed to interview Langley through the basement window. Langley, with the refined vocabulary of a Columbia graduate, explained his philosophy. "We are victims of a changing world. We don't want to be part of your noise." This interview only fueled the legend. The brothers were now a brand of mystery, their wealth a myth that grew with every year of their isolation. The rumors of millions in the walls were not entirely unfounded. Their real estate holdings alone were appreciating at a rate that far outstripped the inflation of the war years. The physical state of the house had by now crossed a critical threshold of structural danger. The accumulation of 140 tons of paper acted as a giant sponge, absorbing ambient moisture and increasing in weight every year. The floor joists, 2 pecks in 10 timbers typical of 19th century construction, were being stressed beyond their ultimate tensile strength. Langley, utilizing his engineering training, began to use pieces of junk as structural shoring. He used the chassis of a car to support a sagging ceiling and stacks of heavy law books to reinforce the walls of his tunnels. It was a masterpiece of perverted engineering, a house built within a house, composed entirely of the debris of a lost century. He was a prisoner of his own creation, but he was also its absolute master. He had eliminated all variables except for the inevitable decay of his brother's body and his own aging frame. The hermits of Harlem were no longer men. They were the living components of a massive, slowly collapsing machine. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States was transformed into the arsenal of democracy. While the nation focused on the industrial mobilization required for a two-front war, the Collyer mansion became an arsenal of the obsolete. The macroeconomic landscape was dominated by the War Production Board, which controlled the distribution of materials like steel, aluminum, and rubber. In the world outside, every scrap of metal was a potential component for a Sherman tank or a P-51 Mustang. Inside 2078 Fifth Avenue, Langley Collyer viewed these same materials as the essential building blocks for his internal fortifications. He became a scavenger of the war effort. While his neighbors participated in scrap drives to support the troops, Langley would scour the streets at night to reclaim discarded items that he deemed technically superior to modern wartime substitutes. To him, the quality of 19th century wrought iron was irreplaceable, a structural necessity for a house that was now supporting a load that exceeded its original architectural specifications by over 300%. The technical crisis of the mansion was exacerbated by the physical properties of cellulose. In the humid New York summers of the early 1940s, the 140 tons of newspaper functioned as a massive, hygroscopic sponge. A single cubic foot of tightly packed newsprint can weigh approximately 50 pounds. However, when saturated with ambient moisture, that weight increases by nearly 30%. This added an estimated 40 tons of dead load to the building's timber frame. The floor joists, made of old-growth yellow pine, were being pushed to their modulus of rupture. Langley, utilizing his engineering training, began to implement emergency shoring. He used the 2,500 law books from Homer's Columbia days as literal pillars, stacking them in columns to support sagging crossbeams. The irony was absolute. The very laws meant to protect private property were now being used as physical struts to prevent that property from collapsing under the weight of its own history. The social fabric of Harlem during the war years was vibrant and patriotic, which only served to sharpen the contrast with the Collyer brothers. The neighborhood had become the black capital of the world, a center of the Double V campaign, victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home. The Collyers, white heirs of a fading Gilded Age elite, were viewed with increasing hostility. Rumors persisted that they were hoarding not just trash but millions of dollars in gold and fifth-column secrets. These rumors acted as a magnet for wartime opportunists and local thieves. Larceny in New York City had increased during the war years due to the black market and general economic strain. Langley responded by welding iron grates over the basement entrances and using heavy-gauge wire to secure the shutters. He was fighting a war of attrition against a neighborhood he no longer understood and a city that he believed was conspiring to steal his inheritance. The financial reality of the brothers was a paradox of paper wealth. By 1943, the property values in Harlem were beginning to stagnate due to systematic redlining by the Federal Housing Administration, yet the intrinsic value of the Collyer holdings, including the brownstone and various municipal bonds, totaled approximately $160,000. In 2026, this would be a portfolio worth roughly $3,200,000. However, the brothers had zero liquid cash. They refused to sell assets, viewing the liquidation of property as a form of surrender. They were asset-rich and cash-poor to an extreme that defied economic logic. When the city attempted to collect back taxes, Langley would ignore the summons, treating the legal documents as just more paper for his hoard. This was a direct challenge to the Lochner-era legal principles Homer had studied. They believed their right to be left alone was absolute, even if it meant the literal destruction of the state's tax base. Inside the mansion, the air quality had reached toxic levels. The lack of ventilation, and the accumulation of organic waste created a high concentration of methane and carbon dioxide. To combat the cold of the 1944 winter, Langley utilized a small kerosene heater, a device that consumed the precious oxygen and released soot and carbon monoxide. The risk of a backdraft or a flashover fire was astronomical. A fire in a structure with 140 tons of paper would reach temperatures of 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit in seconds, creating a chimney effect that would incinerate the entire block. Langley, ever the engineer, tried to account for this by creating fire breaks of iron boxes, but these only served as more obstacles in the tunnels. He was managing a failing system with increasingly desperate technical patches, unaware that the true threat was not fire or thieves, but the simple, unrelenting force of gravity. As the war neared its end in 1945, the brothers were more isolated than ever. They had ignored the death of Roosevelt, the fall of Berlin, and the dawn of the atomic age. For them, the only timeline that mattered was the daily accumulation of the New York Times, which Langley insisted on keeping so that Homer could catch up on the news once his sight was restored. This was the ultimate archival obsession, the belief that time could be paused and then replayed. But time was not a record. It was a physical weight. The newsprint was yellowing, the ink was fading, and the structural integrity of the Collyer empire was reaching its yield point, the moment when a material can no longer return to its original shape and begins to fail permanently. The world had won its war, but for the brothers at 2078 Fifth Avenue, the most dangerous phase of their private conflict was just beginning. By 1946, Langley Collyer had moved beyond mere fortification. He had entered the realm of defensive architecture. His primary objective was the total neutralization of any intruder through the application of mechanical physics. The Collyer trap was not a singular device, but a series of interlocking deadfalls integrated into the very tunnels he used for transit. The technical basis for these traps was the center of gravity principle. Langley would stack iron ammunition boxes, heavy machinery parts, and bundles of newsprint in vertical columns that were metastable, meaning they were stable only as long as they were not disturbed by a lateral force. These stacks were held in place by tripwires made of high tensile strength piano wire, salvaged from his 14 instruments. In the dim light of a kerosene lamp, these wires were virtually invisible, stretched across the tunnels at ankle or chest height. The physics of a deadfall trap are devastating. A 400-pound stack of paper falling from a height of 6 feet generates approximately 2,400 foot-pounds of energy. In clinical terms, this is enough force to cause immediate crush syndrome, characterized by major shock and renal failure after the release of myoglobin into the bloodstream from crushed muscle tissue. Langley's engineering was precise. He knew exactly which bundles were the keystones of his barricades. He created lock and key passages where he had to move his body in a specific sequence of angles, a human algorithm, to avoid triggering a collapse. If an intruder attempted to follow, the variance in their gait or weight would exceed the tolerances of the trap, resulting in a kinetic failure. The mansion was no longer a home. It was a large-scale, low-tech weapon system designed to protect a fortune that was now buried under 3 decades of debris. The inventory of the shadow was as bizarre as it was vast. Among the items Langley used as structural components were a horse's jawbone, the chassis of a 1920s motorcycle, and thousands of empty oil cans. The oil cans were a curiosity of the era. Metal containers for lubricating fluids that, once emptied, were usually discarded. Langley kept them, stacking them in honeycombed patterns that provided a surprising amount of compressive strength while remaining lightweight. He also hoarded obsolete technology. X-ray machines from his father's practice, hundreds of rolls of exposed but undeveloped film, and early phonograph cylinders made of fragile wax. The cost of these cylinders in the early 1900s was about 25 cents, or $8 in 2026, but their historical and archival value was being destroyed by the very hoarding intended to save them. The wax was blooming, a process where the fatty acids migrate to the surface, creating a white mold-like coating that erases the recorded sound. The secondary characters of this period were the urban explorers of the 1940s, daring local residents who would try to peek through the cracks in the boarded windows. One such observer reported seeing Langley moving like a ghost through the basement, his movements jerky and mechanical. This was a symptom of what would later be classified in psychiatric literature as Diogenes syndrome, characterized by extreme self-neglect, social withdrawal, and hoarding. Langley was not merely eccentric, he was suffering from a profound neurological breakdown of the frontal lobe's executive functions. He could still perform complex engineering calculations and play Chopin, but he could no longer distinguish between a valuable legal document and a piece of rotting cardboard. His wealth was now a sunk cost, a financial term describing money already spent that cannot be recovered. He was throwing good money and his own life after the bad money of his hoard. Macroeconomically, the year 1946 saw the beginning of the post-war inflation spike. The price of consumer goods rose by 18% in a single year as wartime price controls were lifted. This only intensified Langley's paranoia. He believed the dollar was becoming worthless and that his hard assets, the pianos, the silver, and even the paper, were the only true stores of value. He was practicing a form of hyperinflationary survivalism. If a piano was worth $3,000 in 1930 and the dollar had lost value, Langley reasoned the piano was now priceless. He was hoarding utility, not currency. However, his utility was inaccessible. He was like a man standing on a mountain of gold who is starving to death because he refuses to trade a single ounce for a loaf of bread. His fortune of $160,000 was a ghost, a number on a ledger that had no impact on his daily struggle for survival. The final layer of the shadow was the relationship between the two brothers. Homer was now a total invalid, his muscles atrophied and his world reduced to the sounds and smells of the hoard. Langley was his only contact, his provider, and his jailer. The power dynamic was absolute. Langley's care for Homer was a perversion of familial duty, a technical exercise in life support within a hostile environment. He had designed a world where Homer was safe from the noise of society, but in doing so, he had stripped his brother of his agency. The tunnels were now so narrow and the traps so sensitive that any external rescue was impossible. Langley had built the perfect system of security, but he had failed to account for the single point of failure in any complex engineering project: himself. If Langley were to be incapacitated, the system would not just fail, it would become a tomb. In 1942, the legal and financial fortress the Collyer brothers had constructed faced its most significant external breach. The Bowery Savings Bank, a titan of New York institutional finance since its founding in 1834, initiated foreclosure proceedings against the property at 2078 Fifth Avenue. The bank's headquarters on 42nd Street, designed by the legendary architectural firm York and Sawyer, stood as a temple of fiscal order, a direct antithesis to the entropic chaos of the Collyer brownstone. The bank's grievance was a matter of strict arithmetic, a mortgage delinquency totaling $6,700. In 2026 currency, this sum represents a purchasing power of approximately $131,500. For most New Yorkers in the midst of a wartime economy, such a debt was insurmountable. For the Collyers, it was merely an administrative annoyance. The technical mechanism of the foreclosure was governed by the New York Civil Practice Act of the era. The process required the physical serving of a summons, a task that proved nearly impossible given the brothers' barricades. When the bank's agents and the New York City Sheriff's Office finally arrived with a moving van and a court order to seize the property, they were met with a wall of solid refuse. The tactical standoff drew a crowd of over 2,000 onlookers, a secondary cast of neighborhood residents and wartime workers who viewed the event as a surreal disruption of the social order. The confrontation reached its climax when Langley Collyer, appearing at a small opening in the basement, produced a check for the full amount of $6,700. Under the Negotiable Instruments Law of 1896, the check was a valid tender of payment, effectively decapitating the bank's legal standing in an instant. This act of sudden liquidity was a psychological blow to the authorities. It proved the brothers were not destitute, but willfully defiant. The macroeconomic context of 1942 New York was defined by the General Maximum Price Regulation, which sought to prevent wartime inflation. While the rest of the city struggled with the rising costs of living and the scarcity of goods, the Colliers operated in a vacuum where the value of money was secondary to the value of stuff. Following the bank's retreat, the city of New York launched a secondary offensive through the Department of Health and the Department of Housing and Buildings. They cited the brothers under Section 183 of the Sanitary Code, which dealt with nuisance properties and the accumulation of materials that could harbor vermin and disease-bearing insects. The technical surveyors noted that the brownstone's windows were not only boarded but sealed with a mixture of tar and heavy-gauge wire, preventing the natural light and ventilation required by the Tenement House Act of 1901. Archive curiosities from the court records indicate that during this legal siege, Langley attempted to countersue the city for harassment of private citizens. He utilized Homer's old legal stationery, a high-rag content bond paper that had resisted the yellowing common and wood pulp papers. His arguments were grounded in a 19th century interpretation of the Fourth Amendment, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects. However, the legal landscape had shifted toward police power, a doctrine that allowed the state to infringe upon private property rights for the sake of public health and safety. The brothers were fighting a 20th century bureaucracy with 19th century philosophy. The cost of their legal resistance was not measured in attorney fees as they represented themselves, but in the further tightening of their isolation. The structural reality of the mansion during this siege was one of increasing static load failure. The 140 tons of material were no longer just sitting on the floors. They were beginning to flow according to the laws of granular mechanics. The angle of repose, the steepest angle at which a sloping surface formed of loose material is stable, was being exceeded in every room. Langley had to constantly re-engineer his tunnels using salvaged timber and steel plates to prevent the lateral pressure from collapsing the interior walls. He was a man trapped in a structural paradox. The more he fortified his home against the city, the more unstable he made the interior environment. He had successfully repelled the Bowery Savings Bank, but in doing so, he had drawn the permanent, hostile attention of the municipal government. The siege of 2078 Fifth Avenue was no longer about a debt. It was about a city that could not tolerate a hole in its reality. By the early months of 1947, the biological and mechanical systems of the Collyer brothers' existence reached a state of terminal failure. Homer Collyer, now 65, had entered a phase of advanced physiological decline. His condition, described by the few who caught glimpses as paralysis, was likely a combination of severe diabetic neuropathy and scurvy, a direct result of the metabolic failure of Langley's orange-only diet. In the technical sense, Homer's body was undergoing catabolism, where the organism begins to consume its own muscle tissue and fat stores to maintain basic cellular function. He had lost the ability to speak. His vocal cords atrophied from years of disuse and the constant inhalation of dust and mold spores. His world was reduced to a 36-square-foot clearing in the debris, where he sat in a state of sensory deprivation, his only stimuli being the rhythmic vibrations of the Fifth Avenue buses passing outside and the shuffling sounds of his brother in the tunnels. Langley Collyer was also reaching the limits of his engineering endurance. At 61, the physical toll of maneuvering 140 tons of material was compounded by a total lack of hygiene and chronic sleep deprivation. He moved through the house in a state of hypervigilance, his mind a map of every tripwire and deadfall trigger he had installed. The midnight runs had become increasingly hazardous. The Harlem of 1947 was experiencing a post-war crime spike, and the presence of a ghost in a tattered overcoat was a target for both curiosity and predation. The cost of basic staples had risen. A loaf of bread in 1947 cost about 13 cents, the equivalent of $1.85 today, but Langley's purchasing power was hampered by his refusal to use modern currency. often trying to pay with coins or bills that had been out of circulation for years. The technical breakdown of the house mirrored the brothers' physical state. The creep of the hoarded material, the slow, permanent deformation of solid materials under the influence of persistent mechanical stresses, was now visible in the very walls of the brownstone. The floorboards were bowing at a rate of several millimeters per month. The relative humidity inside the house was trapped at a constant 85%, creating an ideal environment for the growth of Stachybotrys cartarum, the toxic black mold. This fungus was not merely a cosmetic issue. It was actively digesting the cellulose in the newspapers and the timber frames of the house, weakening the structural integrity of Langley's fortress from the inside out. He was an engineer who had lost control of his materials. A secondary character of critical importance emerged during this period, the anonymous caller. On the morning of March 21, 1947, an individual contacted the police claiming there was a dead body in the house. This call remains a mystery of forensic history. Some believe it was a neighbor who could no longer tolerate the scent of decay, while others suspect it was Langley's final, subconscious cry for help. The New York City Medical Examiner's Office, then under the leadership of Dr. Thomas Gonzalez, prepared for a routine DOA, dead on arrival case. They were unaware that they were about to enter a structural and psychological labyrinth. The protocols for forensic recovery in 1947 did not include heavy excavation. Yet that is exactly what the site would require. In his final days, Langley's paranoia focused on the nylon thread. He had replaced many of his earlier copper tripwires with nylon fishing line, a material that had gained popularity after the war. Nylon is a synthetic polymer with high elasticity, but it is susceptible to ultraviolet degradation and stress relaxation over time. Langley, unaware of the long-term chemical properties of the polymer, did not realize that his triggers were becoming unstable. The very traps designed to protect the brothers were now hair triggers, sensitive to the slightest change in temperature or vibration. He continued to rastejar, crawl through the tunnels, carrying water and mashed food to a silent Homer, a man performing a ritual for a god that had already departed. In the darkness of the tomb, the margin for error had reached zero. One displaced bundle, one snapped thread of nylon, and the weight of 40 years would finally achieve its goal. On approximately March 9, 1947, the mechanical probability of catastrophe within the Collyer mansion reached 100%. Langley Collyer, then 61 years old, was engaging in his routine logistical transit through a tunnel located in the front hallway. He was transporting a container of water and a mixture of mashed food intended for his brother, Homer. The tunnel, a masterpiece of perverted engineering, was a canyon of compressed newspapers and iron boxes, some reaching a vertical height of 15 feet. The stability of these walls was maintained by a complex series of lateral braces and tripwires. As Langley Rastejo crawled through a section of the tunnel barely 2 feet in diameter, he inadvertently applied a localized force to a trigger wire, a single strand of high-tensile nylon that had become brittle due to the extreme environmental acidity of the house. The failure was instantaneous. The trigger wire was the single point of failure for a deadfall trap consisting of several hundred pounds of the New York Times bundled with heavy-gauge twine. The kinetic energy released was approximately 3,200 foot-pounds, creating a localized structural collapse. In forensic engineering terms, Langley was subjected to static compression, where the weight of the debris pinned his torso against the floor, preventing the expansion of his thoracic cavity. He died of asphyxiation within minutes. He was located only 3 meters from the clearing where Homer sat. Because of the acoustic dampening properties of 140 tons of paper, Homer, who was blind and paralyzed, likely heard only a muffled thud, followed by a silence that would last for the rest of his life. Homer Collyer's final days represent a study in biological survival under extreme deprivation. For the next 12 days, he remained in his seated position, waiting for a brother who would never return. In the late 1940s, the clinical understanding of starvation was being refined by studies such as the Minnesota starvation experiment. Homer's body would have undergone a systematic shutdown, First, the depletion of glycogen stores, followed by the catabolism of adipose tissue, and eventually skeletal muscle. Without water, the renal system fails as the blood volume decreases and electrolyte concentrations reach toxic levels. Homer died on or about March 20th, 1947. When patrolman William Barker finally breached the house the following day, he found Homer in his velvet robe. A garment that, if purchased new in the 1920s for $50, would represent a $1,500 luxury item today. Now a shroud for a man who died of thirst while sitting atop a fortune. The macro context of the ensuing 18-day search for Langley became a media sensation that paralyzed the city's imagination. New York in 1947 was transitioning into the Cold War era, a time of increasing suspicion and civil defense. The NYPD and the Department of Sanitation were forced to invent a new forensic methodology: archaeological policing. They could not simply clear the house. The risk of a total structural collapse required a meticulous layer-by-layer excavation. The cost of this operation was immense, involving dozens of men and heavy equipment. Each day the search failed to find Langley. The rumors grew. Some speculated he had fled to Atlantic City. Others believed he was hiding in a secret sub-basement with millions in gold. The reality was much more clinical. On April 8, 1947, searcher Artie Matthews finally detected the scent of advanced decomposition in a tunnel just feet from where Homer had been found. Langley's body was recovered under a 2-foot layer of newspapers and a rusted iron bedstead. The entomological evidence, the presence of specific blowfly larvae, confirmed he had predeceased his brother by nearly 2 weeks. The fortress had worked perfectly. It had kept the world out, but it had also ensured that no one could hear the cries or the struggle of its occupants. The very engineering Langley had used to protect his brother had become the mechanism of their mutual annihilation. The total cash found on Langley's person was less than $10, but the real estate assets he left behind remained a frozen empire, waiting for the probate courts to begin their own form of excavation. The post-mortem inventory of 2078 Fifth Avenue remains one of the most bizarre forensic ledgers in New York history. Over the course of 3 months, the Department of Sanitation removed 140 tons of material from the 12-room brownstone. This was not a random collection of refuse. It was a technical archive of a dying elite. The inventory included 14 pianos, ranging from concert Steinways to uprights, whose combined value in 1947 was estimated at $35,000, or roughly $510,000 in 2026. These instruments, once the pinnacle of Victorian mechanical precision, were extracted through the windows using heavy-duty cranes, their spruce soundboards cracked and their internal tensions lost to decades of neglect. Also recovered was the chassis of the Ford Model T, a 1920s motorcycle, and thousands of medical and legal books that represented the wasted education of 2 Ivy League scions. The financial ruins were equally complex. While the brothers lived in a state of starvation, they possessed liquid and semi-liquid assets that were staggering for the era. Forensic accountants discovered bank books for dozens of accounts, many of which had been inactive for 20 years. They found approximately $2,000 in cash, mostly in small denominations hidden within the pages of books, which would have a purchasing power of $28,500 today. More significantly, the total value of their estate, including the properties in Harlem and Manhattan, was appraised at $100,000 in 1947. In 2026 terms, this represents a fortune of $1,045 million. Under the laws of intestate succession, the legal framework for those who die without a valid will, this wealth did not go to the city, but to a group of 23 distant cousins, many of whom had never met the brothers. The Collyers had spent their lives protecting their wealth from outsiders, only to have it liquidated and distributed to strangers by the very state they had defied. The technical legacy of the Collyer brothers moved from the probate court to the field of firefighting and urban safety. The New York City Fire Department, FDNY, officially adopted the term Collier's Mansion to describe any residential structure where the excessive accumulation of contents poses a life safety hazard to both occupants and first responders. In modern firefighting tactics, a Collier's mansion fire is categorized by extreme fire loading, where the British thermal units, BTUs, generated by the burning mass exceed the cooling capacity of standard hose lines. The structural density of such homes creates a chimney effect and increases the risk of flashover by 400%. Langley Collyer, the engineer, had inadvertently authored a new chapter in the Manual of Structural Firefighting, a chapter written in the soot of his own failures. The physical brownstone at 2078 Fifth Avenue did not survive the brothers for long. In the summer of 1947, the Department of Buildings declared the structure inherently dangerous and unfit for human habitation. The lateral pressure of the hoard had permanently compromised the load-bearing masonry walls. The house was demolished in July 1947, its brick and mortar ground into rubble and hauled to a landfill, joining the 140 tons of paper that had once filled it. Today, the site is occupied by the Collyer Brothers Park, a small paved urban pocket park. It is a rare example of a negative monument, marking the spot where something was removed rather than where something was built. The park offers no shade from the 19th century trees that once stood there. It is a flat, empty space in a neighborhood that has moved on. The final philosophical conversion of the Collyer story is the realization that wealth is not an absolute value, but a function of utility. The brothers possess the pedigree of success, the strategy of the engineer, and the inheritance of the elite, yet they died in a state of deprivation that would be unacceptable in a modern prison. They were the ultimate practitioners of absolute ownership, a concept that states a man's home is his castle, but they forgot that a castle without a gate is merely a dungeon. As the last of their 14 pianos was smashed into a dumpster in 1947, the world received its final lesson from the hermits of Harlem. The things you own end up owning you. In the end, the only thing the Collyer brothers successfully preserved was the silence of a grave they spent 40 years building for themselves.